On behalf of National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, I cordially welcome one and all for today's talk. Abanindranath Tagore, Reclaiming the Narrative Voice, by renowned art historian, Professor R. Siva Kumar. To introduce Raman Siva Kumar, born 3rd December 1956, is an internationally noted contemporary Indian art historian, art critic, and curator. In 2010, in his interview with the Web of Stories, the eminent artist K.J. Subramaniam refers to R. Sivakumar as one of the best art historians. R. Sivakumar's major research has been in the area of early Indian modernism with special focus on the Shantiniketan school. He has written several important books, lectured widely on modern Indian art, and contributed articles to prestigious international projects such as Art Journal, Grove Art India, online, on the Dictionary of Art, Oxford University Press. He has awarded the Kesari Puraskaram for art writing by Lalit Kala Academy, Kerala in 2010. He has also curated major exhibitions like Shantiniketan, The Making of Contextual Modernism, and The Last Harvest, paintings of Abanindranath Tagore, and retrospective of important Indian artists such as Rabindranath Tagore, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, co-curated with Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, K.J. Subramaniam. He has also co-curated many international exhibitions on behalf of one and all and the National Gallery of Modern Art. I request Professor R. Shivkumar sir to kindly, and I request everybody to welcome him with applause.
Good evening, everyone, and I am happy to be here, and thankfully, due to the invitation from the NGMA to come and talk to you this evening. So there are many artists and friends from many years ago in the city, so it's always a great pleasure to come and see all of you, and I can see many faces in the audience, so it's also a very emotionally kind of personally gratifying moment for me to come and be here today. What I'm going to talk to is about an artist from the beginning of modern Indian art. I mean, Abanindranath Tagore, who, of course, was one of the main artistic voices in the beginning of the 20th century, then sort of faded away from our discourse. And this artist has sort of teased my kind of curiosity. Like most others of my generation, I started by kind of totally disregarding him, and there was something that still kept pricking me, because two of the great Indian artists whom I respected a great deal, I'll do it, Binod Bihari Mukherjee and K.J. Subramaniam, they thought very highly of him. So as a student, I've always wondered why these two highly sensitive, intellectually very equipped people, they thought that Abanindranath was so important, while the rest of us thought he was passé, he is gone, and he doesn't matter. So that is what triggered my interest in a way. So after thinking about it for a few years, I really got an opportunity to see the original works. We normally don't see most of his original works because it's in a private trust and they are not welcoming. They don't show it to anybody. So it was all kept locked up. So nobody really could see the works. due to some circumstances, they agreed to have an exhibition of his works in Shantiniketan, and I, by chance, got the opportunity to curate it. So I had to go and look at all the works. And when I saw his entire output, because there are about 400, 500 works in the Ravindra Bharati Society which held all these things, then my eyes opened. I thought, okay, I understand why Binod Bihari and Subramanian thought so highly of this artist. And that is where I began to really document and study him. And it took me quite some while, but then later I wrote and published about him. So it's a pleasure talking about this artist today. Now, all of us who have worked a little bit with Indian art, we know that there is, especially Indian art of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, there is quite a bit of the, what you call the narrative in it. Now, when you look at a painting like, I suppose, yeah, you can see it here. So when you look at a painting like this, a Mughal miniature, now there is so much to see in this, and it's an event that is happening from history, of course, which is also narrated on the page of the book. But even if you don't read all that, you can see so much what is happening. An army crossing a river, a flooded river, and then about the landscape, about the people, even about the animals. So there are stories. And really, our art is about telling these stories. And it's not telling the stories in an abstract manner, but it's telling the stories of a community, of a context, of a period in which, people are living and their environment and their kind of thing. Now, when the environment shifts, the stories might also change. But it's just not a king's portrait, but you get to see much more about it. His relationship with the people, court life, the landscape of the place, the seasons, all that kind of thing. So these are paintings that tell you a lot of stories about the place. Now you can see that storytelling probably was there in many art. Even European art after the Renaissance had a lot of storytelling. So storytelling is not entirely just our own kind of a thing. All those Renaissance masters, when they painted, they're telling stories, biblical stories, maybe stories about their contemporary world and so on. So that was there, but we were telling stories in a very different way, and that is what we see. We had different aesthetics, we employed different colors, designed differently, and we used a certain freedom and imagination which was different from the other parts of the world. Now, in some ways, all these values disappeared with the coming of colonialism. Now, what then sees that the images of India that we have under colonial rule is the stories vanish. You have maybe here a particular sepoy coming from a particular community and his wife. So it's almost like in an ethnographic museum, you're seeing a doll kind of a thing. Or objects. There are trees and plants and animals and so on. But unlike in the Mughal painting or in the Rajasthani painting, they are not there as part of stories. They are by themselves. So in a sense, the stories are taken apart and India in a way is itemized. So it's like a scientist categorizing objects in India into different categories. But what we had before that was actually stories, and stories that brought everything around you together. Now that was gone. And in some sense, this is what India lost through colonization. The ability to tell the stories and ability to kind of create a collective picture of life. Now, of course, there was another kind of storytelling that came up with people like Ravi Verma, who took on the Western models of telling those stories and tried to create those. But you can see there's a huge difference between this and the previous one. That expansiveness that the Mughal miniature showed in terms of telling the stories, not telling the stories of a particular individual or a particular event, but telling the stories of a whole kind of thing. You can probably intuit some of that even here, but then that obviousness is gone from this kind of storytelling. Okay. And this, as you can, anybody who has done preliminary art history will say that this is almost modeled after the neoclassical tradition of narrating things, stories. Okay. Now, and this was at that point the nationalist thought. I mean, somebody was like Ravi Verma, I don't think he was not a nationalist, he was a nationalist, but that fell into the category which the early nationalists thought about self-improvement. So if you want to improve yourself as Indians, we have to then learn all the good things from the Europeans. And you are imitating them or copying them or doing things similar as an effort at self-improvement. Now, you can see that in writers of that time and so on. Now, by the end of the 19th century, this idea of self-improvement was beginning to be questioned, because partly helped by colonialism itself. The colonial rulers, as they wanted to govern our country better, they began to document what is there. So they had all the surveys, the archaeological survey, the geological survey, the geographical surveys, all the surveys came, which means they're mapping India in terms of various categories, of course. But in the process, what happened was that we rediscovered a whole tradition, which we didn't know about. I mean, say like the Ajanta paintings, we forgot about that until and unless, I mean, sometime in the 19th century, it was rediscovered by people who, a hunting party which went out and found the murals, and it was brought back. Then people began to study it. I mean, people from outside came here and copied it. There are many groups of people who copied it, including some of our artists like Nandalal and others who went and worked there. So there was this rediscovery of this large Indian tradition. And once that happened, they realized that, the artists realized that we had a rich tradition here, of which we forgot, but I mean, it is as important as what we are taking from the West. And there was also a movement against colonialism. The anti-colonial movement had started. And the first thing was, it was not, although in 1857 we had the mutiny, but it was not so much the effort to really snatch back political freedom that came, but it was the effort to kind of recollect our cultural heritage. So it was a kind of cultural nationalism that first came. And the first stirrings of cultural nationalism in a way happened in Bengal, because that's where the anti-colonial movement started, because the rulers were there at that time. Calcutta was the capital, and so obviously it started there in some ways. Now, so once we began to see this whole rich tradition of thing, they started thinking, why don't we revive this? Why don't we get back something of that? And rather than just do things like Ravi Verma was doing here. So Abanindranath was one of the first people who did that. Of course, he didn't start off by that idea. He, like most others, Rabindranath, all of them admired Ravi Verma at some point. And they were kind of also thinking in terms of reviving it, all Indian subject matter, but not necessarily painting in any way. And Abanindranath, like most people of his, kind of background, he went to study under European masters. There were two artists under whom he studied. One was an Englishman, another was an Italian. So he studied under them sporadically. He didn't continue continuously, but from 1871 onwards, he started studying under these people for various periods of time. So he was working even before that, but in 1892 he goes to one of them, to learn, formally. This is Olinto Gilhardi. I mean, he is an Italian artist, and we know some of his work now. So he studied for a few months, 6 months or so, and he also went to this other artist called Charles Palmer, which is a British artist. So there were these artists European artists who were working in different cities, and these artists were there in Calcutta, so he went and studied under them. I mean, he did oil painting under Gilhardi and watercolor and pastels under Charles Palmer. So, but while he was doing that, that's the time when the whole idea of cultural nationalism is beginning to take shape. So that bit, and there were people in his family who were organizing this. There was something called the Hindu Mela at that time, which was not a religious thing, but it was a cultural thing. And it was a fair where all kinds of things were shown. There was also art shown and so on. So many of these people, I mean, some people from the Tagore family and also some of their friends were behind this organization. So he began to look at other things around him. And there were also certain things that he didn't react to in Western art. The art education was something that he kind of thing. Of course, his teachers put him to study anatomical lessons and studying the dead body and things like that, and the skeleton, drawing from the skeleton. And Abanindranath was too hypersensitive in a sense. In fact, when he was put into study all these things, I mean, it gave him, I mean, he came down with fever. And so he decided, this is not, I'm not going to do this kind of study anymore. And so there was also a personal revolt in a sense, something that his sensibilities didn't, I mean, allow him to do. So that is where he begins to look for alternatives. And in the beginning, when he did that, you can see, I mean, the time he is actually going to study under these teachers, he's actually illustrating one of Rabindranath's early poems, Chitrangada. I mean, later it became a dance drama and all that, but he had written it, and Chitrangada is a very interesting text because it is probably one of the first proto-feminist texts. I mean, a woman is revolting against the idea of she being accepted on the basis of her beauty, and she wants to be accepted on her own terms. So, but when you look at the illustrations, you can see that Abanindranath is doing illustrations to that just as a normal illustrator might do for a magazine or whatever kind of thing. That the way we understand illustration. So he was not thinking in terms of, because Tagore's Chitrangada was a kind of entirely new person. Now Abanindranath was using the old ideas and the pre-Raphaelite kind of notions of womanhood, etc., to illustrate that. So you can see the text and the image don't really do. The image is just an embellishment. It's not something that interprets the text in any way. So that is where he started, and he did this and many others. He illustrated Rabindranath's elder brother had a very famous poem called Swapna Prayan, which is a very important literary text, and he illustrated that. He illustrated some of the poems of Rabindranath and so on. Of course, then while he was doing all that in, I mean, around 1896, he becomes interested in miniature painting. He accidentally gets a whole set of miniature paintings gifted to him by one of his relatives, and there was another set of miniature paintings, I mean, which came from England. So there was a person, an amateur artist in England, who was very close to one of his granduncles. And Abanindranath, you will see as we go, he has always this interest in discovering family histories and so on. That uncle had died long back, and so there was no connection, but through some of his people, he really manages to trace her back. And then he gets into contact with this amateur artist in England, and she gives her some of her works. She worked in small miniature size, and there were illustrations to the kind of Irish ballads and so on. So she gave those things to him. So he got these two small sets of miniatures, one late Mughal, the other European. And that is where he thinks, okay, let me move away from that academic large oil paintings and things like that, and go into miniatures in a way. This is a very tiny work. It is little bigger than a stamp, maybe this size kind of thing. That's all it is. So it's a tiny little work really. And most of these works which I'm going to show, there are only 4 or 5 inches at the most, and they are quite, these set of works. So these are related to, the story of Krishna. So which is normally, we call that, art historians call it Krishna Lila series. But what was happening at the same time as he was thinking about this, there was this other person, E.B. Havel, who was a teacher in Madras, and then he shifted to Calcutta. E.B. Havel was having similar ideas. He was thinking that Indian art should be revived. Why should Indian art schools not look at Indian art? Why should they be copying just Greek and Roman copies? But let us introduce them to Indian art. So that was his idea, and he wanted to Indianize art education in India. So he was shifted to Calcutta, and through an aunt of his, Rabindranath's elder brother's wife, E.B. Havel gets to know Abanindranath. So he's invited to their house, and he sees some of these first works, and Havel is quite impressed because he was looking for somebody who would support his case. And there was this rather well-to-do Indian artist who is also trying something similar. So they team up together. He says, come and join me in the art school, and you become the vice principal. Let us work together. Of course, it took Havel about 10 years to convince him that he should join the art school. So eventually he does in 1905. So from 1896 to 1905, Havel was just persuading him to do that. Now, he did the whole series of these pictures in this kind of thing. These are the first ones which we normally think that where he's actually adopting something like a kind of miniature kind of thing. And people thought this should be thought of as a revival of Indian miniatures. Now we'll look into that idea, whether is it a revival in that sense, and what are the differences. Now, in some way, he's actually carrying forward what Ravi Verma did, because it is the themes are mythological, religious, and so on. But the difference is in terms of the stylistics that he's trying to do. He's, as some historians would say, he's trying to marry Indian subject matter with Indian style, in a sense. But Ravi Verma doing Indian subject matter in a European style. So that kind of difference is there. Now, here you can see these other pictures, and when you look at some of these pictures, you can see there is something like the miniatures in terms of the thing. There are elements which some of them look like the composition here, for instance, would look like something like this, 3 tiers of things. So how the space is conceived in a miniature. You have the foreground, then that is kind of thing, the middle ground, then the back, but all of them stacked up one above the other, not actually going back in perspective, but sort of stacked up one above the other. Now that kind of thing you can see, but all the other things that when you look, it's not that kind of Indian, or it's not like the miniature painting. Here, for instance, you can see he's using light and shade. There is single source of light and so on. So that really kind of makes a change. And then you have text in all these things. As we saw, these texts are there written beneath it. So then you see complications happening. The image above is a hybrid style. There is some elements of the Indian miniatures, some of European watercolors, and then you have something like this, which is like the Persian text in Mughal miniatures. Now, but this is not Persian. This is actually Bengali, written like Persian. Okay, so basically, you can see that there are multiple cultures getting together. You can see, if you look at the thing, there are 3 traces. One, of course, the format of the Mughal miniatures or whatever Indian miniatures, and then you have the text which goes clearly Islamic and Persian, and then the medium itself, watercolor, and all European. And in fact, he always used British materials. He used Winsor and Newton watercolors, their brushes, Wattsman paper. So in terms, you can see that he's dipping into three different traditions. The European, the Indian, the Islamic are all coming together. And this is exactly what other members of the Tagore family also did. Their family, Rabindranath remembers or writes about his early childhood and says that our family was an amalgamation of these three things: European culture, Indian culture, and the Islamic. All three came together. They were scholars of Sanskrit and so on, and Abanindranath himself knew Sanskrit quite well, and he was also studied Persian, so he was kind of thing. So you can see from Ram Mohan onwards down, there were people who dipped into both the Sanskritic tradition and the Persian tradition and the European. So all three of these things are coming together. So what looks like the first Indianized paintings of Abanindranath actually is an amalgamation of these three different traditions. So basically, when we talk of him as a revivalist, it is very kind of loosely said. He wasn't a revivalist in the sense that we normally understand it, the word today. Now, his work was then an eclectic kind of bringing together of different traditions. Now, after this, he did various things. He had an interest in literature because he was also a writer. He was writing things all the time. He started off as an author around the same time. And so he did these works on Kalidasa's Ritu Samhara. There are kind of number of them. But again, you can see there are European elements, like the pre-Raphaelite elements are very kind of obvious in the way he's doing the coloring, the changing the proportions, and the kind of almost delicate ornateness that he brings to it. But the other new thing that came into his work was actually the discovery of Mughal painting, because when Havel comes and sees his work, he tells him, come to the art college. And Havel was actually, he sold off a lot of the plaster cast and all that kind of thing, copies of European art in the art college, and he replaced them with Indian miniatures and sculptures and so on. So what you call the Indian Museum in Calcutta is actually the nucleus is what Havel collected for the art school. The art school and the Indian Museum are actually close together, next to each other, and until very recently, until we bureaucratically separated them, there was a passage. You could, all the students, even now they go and study there, so there was a connected passage. It was their collection in a sense. So he went there, and Havel showed him a Mughal miniature, Mansoor's crane, and of course, in those days, Havel also gave him a kind of enlarging magnifying glass and asked him to look at it through that. So he looked at Mansoor through this magnifying glass, and he saw the immense amount of detailing that Mansoor put into the work. So he realized that there could be another kind of realism, which is not the Western kind of realism, and which the Mughal miniatures represented. So he became interested in the Mughal thing, and you will see that not only just in Mughal art, but he also became interested in Mughal culture in some sense, and it becomes part of his. He started imagining him almost like as if he's a continuation of the Nawabs in some sense. Okay. So this is what, the passing of Shah Jahan, the death of Shah Jahan, and actually this is interesting. This is an oil painting on very small board. It's not a watercolor. It's not a miniature in that sense. It's an oil painting, but creating. And then if you look at the way the forms are done, you will see how the contours are flattened, and then the contours are given that importance. Now, in that sense, he is actually closer to the pre-Raphaelites again. So, and then if you look at the sky, it is all very atmospheric in a sense. So, he is taking things again from different traditions and bringing them together. And there is something more about it, and there is always a kind of autobiographical thing when it comes. Now, this painting is, for a while after those things which I showed, he stopped painting for a while because his daughter died, and young daughter, and he was heartbroken. So in a sense, this painting of Shah Jahan in his old age, in the company of his daughter, I mean, that is also a kind of way of remembering his own daughter for him. So those paintings also had a very personal thing, and we'll come to that again, we'll notice this. Okay, and he never traveled, that's another thing. And you can see how all the details are still very accurate. I mean, he was somebody who was very reluctant to travel. So he, most of the time he sat on the veranda of his house in Calcutta and spent his time there, painted. That was a studio and the southern veranda. So, I mean, in Bengali, even his, I mean, the book on him is called Dokkinir Veranda, the southern veranda. That is where he spent most of his time. But sitting there, and he had all these archaeological evidences and so on, so he was studying all those things, and he would create exact detailings even without moving out of that, of his house. And you'll see he had a long, from about 1900 onwards, he has this long tradition or interaction with the Mughals, and he does various things. I mean, Shah Jahan, Jahangir, Aurangzeb, all these people are people whom he paints again and again. And sometimes in his writing, there is even a kind of, he's in conversation with Jahangir, talking about, I mean, he and Jahangir talking about their children, kind of thing. So you have all these things. He is almost living in that world in some sense. But again, this is Shah Jahan and the building of the Taj, incomplete Taj in the distance, and you can see there the craftsmen waiting for him, his attention and so on. And yet, in a sense, it's almost like a miniature with all the borders, all those other kind of detailing of the figures and so on. But yet, you look at the sky and the way it's painted, so it's very much European in that sense. So he's actually mixing these cultures together. And then the painting, which is probably the painting by which he is known, I mean, his Bharat Mata, which is again a very intriguing painting, because that is what made him a nationalist in most of the stories. Now, he was not looking, and again, Bharat Mata again has that personal thing. Now, it's supposed to be an icon for the nation, etc., etc. 2 or 3 things. It is not the Bharat Mata of, say, Bankim Chandra. I mean, that Bharat Mata is somebody who wants her children to sacrifice themselves for her freedom. But this is a Bharat Mata which is taking care of her children. So it's a benevolent Bharat Mata. She is kind of offering them food, clothing, knowledge, spiritual succor, and so on. So, and of course, the Bharat Mata is modeled on Sister Nivedita, and again recalls his dead daughter in a way. So he sometimes says that face is like my daughter, sometimes says it's based on Nivedita. Now, why do they come together? Because his daughter died in a plague which affected Calcutta. And Nivedita was somebody who really went out and nursed the plague victims. So these 2 figures come together in a way in this Bharat Mata. So there is also this very personal element that comes into his paintings. And as we look, the technique is what we now call the wash technique, which he learned from visiting Japanese artists. Now, so when you go back again in terms of the elements that make the painting, as I said earlier, all the materials are European. Technique is based on his interaction with Japanese artists, and his Bharat Mata is a combination of Sister Nivedita and his daughter. So the Bharat Mata is not entirely Indian. It is actually including all those things. And Nivedita identified us so much that if you remember Rabindranath's novel Gora, which is also about her in the background. It's partly the over-identification that Nivedita did with India in some sense that Tagore is critiquing. So there is this white boy who grows up as an Indian, not knowing he was adopted, and then at a much later stage towards the end of the novel, he realizes he is, an adopted European child. And then, because he was a very conservative, Brahminical kind of Indian, Gora, to start with. And when it is revealed to him that he is no Indian, he is no Hindu, but he is an adopted, Firangi, and then suddenly Gora's identity is lost. And he decides, and the last sentence in the novel is very important. He says, from today, every Indian, in a sense, I am Indian in a much larger way. The food of every Indian is my food. This is what he says. So in a sense, he doesn't want his Brahmin. He's deciding to be an Indian without that Brahminical thing, halo that he carried. And he wants to identify, but identify as being part of every community in India. So that is how, it was slightly a critique of Sister Nivedita's Indianness in a sense that Tagore was making. But anyhow, so you see that this painting is actually again an coming together of completely diverse things. There is that idea when we think about the Indianness, very often we think about isolating and keeping out everything else. Taking part of the rest of the world. That's not the way that he was thinking. So the idea that we have, because when I started my research, everybody used to categorize Abanindranath as a revivalist, and very often the term was he is a Hindu revivalist. Now there is enough material already to see that he was not kind of thing. If anything, he thought he was a descendant of the Mughals rather than anything else. Yeah, because even had special cooks to cook him Mughalai things. So they had European cooks, Indians who were trained in European culinary things to cook them European dishes, continental thing. So they had, both the Islamic, the Mughalai tradition of food culture, as well as the continental food culture, along with the Bengali kind of thing. So they had all these different, even cooks in their house, so that they could cook all those things. So it was a very different culture in which he grew up. So his mother India then is very different. And then there are also other things that really comes. Like his mentors. Nivedita was one of those people who mentored a lot of Indian artists in the beginning, and also Havel. Both of them were people who talked in favor of public art. They thought, of course, the term they used was civic art at those days, but they wanted Indians to kind of do murals, do buildings, architecture, and then bring in all those things as you see in the older traditions. In fact, Nivedita played a role in taking some of these students of Abanindranath to Ajanta, kind of thing. So now that was one aspect, but Abanindranath, and in fact Havel got, mural painters from Rajasthan to teach in Calcutta Art College. Abanindranath never went that side. He never took up. Because of Havel, he did some small little slabs. 2 slabs are still there, but he never painted. He did a layout which was completed by Nandalal later, and he never painted a mural. So that kind of public art was not something that he was interested in. He was interested in the small, the intimate, the personal, and that is where his thing. In fact, even his wash painting that we call is a stylistic or a technical innovation that he did to express his own sensibility. It was not, the wash painting is completely different technically from any traditional Indian way of painting. And because it puts a little watercolor on the paper, then what he does is he dips it in water or has a big broad Japanese brush, washes water over that so the excess color is washed away, and then he will do it repeatedly, sometimes as many as 30 times, and the color kind of seeps into the paper little by little, and it gets a very good diffused kind of coloring. And as you can see here, this is one of the first paintings done in that manner. So this is something that he invents, but he invents it so that it suits his sensibility, and he's actually in every respect trying to be more of an individual in a way. And this comes through, as I said, the Japanese. And around 1903, there was this Japanese scholar called Okakura Kakuzo who came to Calcutta, to India. Of course, he came to India not for the sake of art. He came to India to invite Vivekananda to Japan, because he was one of the pioneers in the idea of Pan-Asianism. And Okakura's Pan-Asianism was not entirely cultural, it was political in some sense. So he wanted to bring Asia together, and he wanted Vivekananda to go and lecture there. And that is why he came, but accidentally stumbles upon Nivedita because of his, he's here for Vivekananda. And then through Nivedita, he comes to the Tagores, and then following him, he sends his artist. Okakura was not only this, kind of man who was imagining of a political Pan-Asianism, but he was also somebody who was doing something similar to what Havel was doing in India, and little senior to him, before him. So he had his own, revival of Japanese traditional art and school art teaching in Japan. That was what he was doing. And he had his own school. Some of the people, in the Japanese academy moved away with Okakura from the traditional academy, and they created their own school. And two of them, very important artists, Taikan and Ishida, comes to Calcutta after Okakura leaves. And they work with Abanindranath in the same space, in that south veranda. They are also working. And it is by watching them that he develops this method. And what happens with these artists, they are also like Abanindranath in a certain way. They call themselves traditional Japanese painters, but they are inventing new things. So one of the things they do is a kind of removed naturalism, where some parts of the painting can be completely kind of, out of focus. Some of it will be in focus. So you are able to use this, organize your painting, according to the selective detailing that, thing. And Abanindranath takes that. This is, of course, the topic is from, Kalidasa's Meghduta. But you can notice how he's doing, and when you look at the details, you can see that how much of the realistic study thing is still there in the way he's rendering the body, in the almost portrait-like detailing of the face, etc. But also certain parts of the painting being completely, out of focus. And then it goes on to his Omar Khayyam series, where you can see more of that. Part of it is in deep detailing, very fine detailing. Part of it is completely washed away, kind of thing, a selective kind of thing. Now, when you look at this, you can see a shift has happened. The first painting I showed was that it was an illustration to Chitrangada, and I said how the character in Chitrangada, Rabindranath's character, is so kind of a feminist kind of thing, and the drawing is almost going in the opposite direction. But here what happens is that the style of the painting and the way it is done and the content of the rubaiyats are coming much closer. So it's like a pictorial equivalent to the text. And he's using these translations of Fitzgerald, and you can see the translation is actually pasted at the bottom of each painting. Now, interestingly, Fitzgerald's translation is what you will today call an Orientalist text, because it's a Persian text, but when he translated, he changed the structure of the text. The actual rubaiyat is not having any kind of, the connections are rhythmic in that text. But Fitzgerald arranges it such a way it looks like it's going from morning till night. And so he brings in a new structure into it, which is not part of the original. And also, there is always this controversy about what is happening. It's almost like in the translations, the sensuality or the pleasures of the world are kind of more highlighted in some way. So this is a completely Orientalist text, and we can say that Abanindranath is not only creating a visual equivalent to the text, but he is also internalizing this Orientalism of the text when he does this. Now he paints this between 1907 and 10. There were two sets that he works. The first set he works in 1907, and 1910 he completes the second set. Now by this we can see, by this time, all the elements that he took from various sources have been amalgamated into a united style. The miniatures, the European elements, the Japanese elements, they have all come together. They don't stand separate. They have all come together into a very personal style. So the technique, the stylistic elements, all that is now fused together, and this is the place where you might say Abanindranath finds himself as a painter. And but there are interesting things even here. You can see, using this wash technique, almost the background is completely undefined, and you can just have these slight thin lines which show maybe spatial depth in some way. And right from the passing of Shah Jahan, we saw how the contours were a kind of thing, the details were kind of minimized and so on, and you can see that interestingly all the details, I mean, you can see that how he does it. But what is interesting is also you see that in certain phases of early Picasso, for instance, it's the same stylistic things which started with pre-Raphaelites go on to to early Picasso throughout. So in some way he's, while doing all this in relation to Indian miniatures, to kind of Japanese and so on, but the trajectory is taking is getting closer to what European artists were doing in some way. Now, in fact, even Western scholars have talked about this phase of Picasso as if it's emerging from the symbolist kind of aesthetics, and it is into the symbolist aesthetics that Abanindranath and in fact all the three Tagores dip into it quite a bit. Now with this, things are changing because there are 3-4 things that happen simultaneously. He started off as part of the Swadeshi movement when he was there. In fact, his Bharat Mata used to be carried, it was copied. Again, that's interesting. I mean, because our early period history is slightly different from what we imagine. The Bharat Mata was copied and made into a banner, and the Swadeshi morchas or the processions used to carry that. And it was copied into a banner by a Japanese painter, not by Abanindranath. And the Indian nationalists were carrying it as their flag. Okay, so all this kind of things were there. But 1907, Havel goes back to England. He's sent back. Actually, the British think that he's losing his balance. He becomes interested in Tantrism and he becomes very emotionally religious and so on. So he's sent back to England. And so his main mentor goes away. Rabindranath, he's totally disappointed with Swadeshi nationalism because it turns around after 1907 into a Hindu-Muslim conflict. And at that moment, I mean, Rabindranath, who was one of the leaders of the Swadeshi movement, he walks out of it. He completely disconnects himself with that, and he begins to focus on Shantiniketan, education, and so on and so forth. So he moves away. The other mentor of Abanindranath, so 2 of them gone, and Nivedita dies. So all the people who actually brought him into the Swadeshi movement, they all either move away or die, they disappear, die. So there was no more reason for Abanindranath. Abanindranath wasn't a person who was naturally a nationalist kind of thing. So he moves away from that altogether, and you can see that difference coming up in the next set of paintings that he did. This is a group of paintings where he responds to the theatre, the local theatrical tradition of what he called jatra. Okay? And this is, of course, Shiva as the kind of the jatra actors do, and or the king or the captive hero. And when he published them, these used to be published in Modern Review or Prabhashi, and there used to be little footnotes. So in this, when he published, he pointed out the chains are actually of paper, kind of thing. So he's actually having a satire in a sense. So this is this highly emotionally charged hero who is a captive, and or the lover, the Bengali Babu who is in swooning over his mistress. So he is standing in front of the mistress's house. She is not letting him in, and you have this highly, totally, pathetic lover. Or Rati, the actress, she's this actress playing the role of Rati, and you can see, such a voluminous figure stomping down the theatre, and all those things like plastic flowers and things. And she is wearing a wristwatch, which is an entirely new thing. It came into the market and people started wearing it, around the First World War. So it is also an entirely new thing. So she is also an actress who is going up in the social profile. So if you look at these paintings, you can see a different side of Abanindranath altogether. And he is both identifying and distancing himself in some sense in these pictures. Now, so he's having it to, a kind of critical scrutiny of your own culture. And here actually he was going back to people in the 19th century, including one of the things, there is this Rabindranath's grandfather, Dwaraganath. He's somebody who Rabindranath doesn't pay attention to. We'll come to that later. But Abanindranath is interested in him because he's a man who kind of collaborates with the British, and therefore, Rabindranath is not interested in him. He is also somebody who was into a lot of mercantile activities, and so all that. So Rabindranath really hardly talks about his grandfather, but Abanindranath is greatly interested in this man, because it's a point where all the cultures are mixing in some sense. And there were many people besides him. There was especially one of the figures who has been translated into English, the Hutumpechar Naksha by Kali Prasanna Sinha. Now, there were many other such texts. Pyari Chand Mitra and so on, many of them, Bhavani Charan, Bandobadhyay, they all wrote these kinds of texts. They are all making fun of the Babus, their culture, their kind of thing. So you might say that it is a literary equivalent from the middle and upper class Babus or the Bhadraloks about themselves. And that is what Abanindranath is probably trying to do in these things. Their cultural values are being looked at, and he is actually, poking fun at that. So, and really Abanindranath was an urbanite. He never left Calcutta. If he traveled like the Europeans, to kind of hill stations, Darjeeling or Ranchi was another one. So he went to these places. He never traveled to the villages. And there is Rabindranath writing again and again, come to the village, I am waiting for you, and so on and so forth. But they rarely traveled, except once or twice much later. But he didn't travel very much. He either sat in Calcutta or during the summers went to these hill stations. So he was an urban elite in every sense, but he also sympathized with the subaltern classes, and that is what comes through in these works. While he can laugh at himself and his class, he is also sympathetic to them. And when you look at this, you can again see the way, for instance, Lautrec probably is, dealing with the similar classes of people in his work, the exaggerations, the kind of anatomical distortions and so on. And of course, Louthrock interestingly looked at Indian works. He was copying Indian sculptures and so on. Abanindranath, probably he should have known, because Abanindranath was a great collector of European art books, so he knew them. But where he takes it from is probably the Japanese ukiyo-e prints, because they had a big collection of ukiyo-e prints, Abanindranath and Abanindranath. So he's actually taking these things from the ukiyo-e prints. So again, you can see, like, he may not be looking at European modern art, but he is having a similar trajectory, because both the Europeans are also looking at the Japanese. And here Abanindranath is also looking at the Japanese, and they are taking similar elements from the Japanese. So they arrive at the same kind of artistic innovation. Now you can see further, I mean, this is a text which is attributed to Shankaracharya, Mohammadkar. And he is actually, I mean, here too he is actually looking at Shankaracharya and the text exactly as he is looking at the Bengal theatre. And the central figure in most of this is here, as you can see, a kind of pandit with a enlarged head and a shrunken body in a well kind of space. And outside you can see through this little hole at the top, I mean, a bird sitting there. So he's somebody who has imprisoned himself in this little well and poring over his text. Or a kind of panda-like figure hugging a kind of, I mean, a Garuda Stamba and kind of thing. Almost a kind of libidinal image in a way. In others, he might have the kind of priest-like figure against this huge, I mean, dominant image of a bull, for instance. So we can see this is also, you should remember that this is the time where Vedanta is becoming almost the equivalent of Indian philosophy. And he's slightly poking fun at that. This world-renowned thing, thinking that whole thing is Maya and this kind of a thing. And so certainly he's kind of thing. And there was also his uncle, I mean, Rabindranath, and his part of the family. They were the Brahma Samaj people who were looking at making the Vedas and the Upanishads central to Indian thing. Now that is also the time, I mean, as I said, that Indian philosophy got reduced just to Vedanta. And he is certainly, I mean, sitting next door, their houses were adjacent to each other within the same compound, and telling us something else altogether. Now, you can see that he is moving away from that earlier narrative tradition that he started, and at this point he is actually venturing out away to images which don't have any narrative content. The image is in some sense self-sufficient, and the trajectory, as I said, that he was looking at the symbolist and the aesthetics. He doesn't refer to somebody like Baudelaire, but he uses the same metaphors as Baudelaire uses in his text. So in his writing, he talks about art, that art, I mean, a painter's kind of vision is like that of the moonlight, not like the sunlight. I mean, the moon takes the light of the sun and transforms it into its own kind of light. So you don't, I mean, directly copy the world, but you take that world and you transform it into something very personal. And that is, he says, what an artist should be doing. This is exactly the imagery, not the moon and the sun imagery, but the content of what Baudelaire is writing, of how imagination transforming the world, and or Mallarmé talking of, you don't represent the world, but you represent the impact or the emotions that the world awakens in you, kind of thing. So he moves into an area where the images don't have a narrative thing. There's no story, no text, but it is kind of evocative. And this goes on. There is, as we will see that there is always a little tussle that goes on for quite some time in Abanindranath, whether he should be moving to this purely pictorial, evocative, and kind of thing, or whether he should get back to the narrative kind of thing. Okay, then what he does next for the 20s, early 20s, he does quite a number of paintings which are based either on, literary characters or historical figures, and there are quite a number of them. I'll show you 2 or 3. This is Vasanta Sena, and we'll notice some of the things, or this woman with the golden necklace, and all these places you can see that he is touching or taking things from different traditions. Once again, for instance, like if you think of the Japanese ukiyo-e, or a little before that the screen paintings, you can see that the contour, and there is a little twist in the figure, which really, everything is flat, but that little twist in the figure really animates it and makes it look three-dimensional, like this. Okay, very flat, but there is this twist. And now this was also taken up by others in Europe. Gaston Klimt, for instance, he used this quite a lot. So you can see again, when he does these things, they are all dipping into the same things, and therefore the effects look similar, comparable. And what is happening here, when he's moving from one figure to the other, the style is changing rapidly. So all these 3 figures that we saw, the style isn't exactly the same. So it seems to be the character determining the style that he works in, rather than the artist himself having a style of his own, personal. Or this pretty famous picture of Gandhi, Tagore, and C.F. Andrews. Now, this again is a very interesting and historically important painting, because in 1921, when Gandhi was embarking on his non-cooperation, Rabindranath was not very convinced if that was the right thing to do. And in fact, Gandhi comes to Calcutta and they have a meeting at his house, at Jorasanko. And just before that, before the meeting, they have already expressed their ideas in writing. And both of them had published that, their disagreements with each other. So this was a closed door meeting. There were only these 3 people there. And none of them said what they discussed. Later there are some little revelations that make after many, many years. But when Abanindranath paints it, it's nobody knows what they discussed. But we can guess, because it is probably they're trying, each one was trying probably to convince the other person to support his work. And what you see, this kind of thing, this rather thoughtful Rabindranath and rather this impish, Gandhi with a smile on his lips, confronting each other. So, and the painting in this way is almost like a Japanese work where you have this Buddhist logans, sitting and debating with each other. Okay. Now, the other thing he does, that I said he never hardly moved out of Calcutta. Finally, a couple of times he went, because the family had their estates in what is now Bangladesh. And for a long time, Rabindranath was looking after all the estates. And later, of course, the estates are divided into the, and then one part goes to Gaganendranath and Abanindranath, the other parts goes to Rabindranath, and so on. And so he's finally forced to go there. He goes there a couple of times. And when he goes to Shila Idaga, it was a time of floods. So he does a number of landscape paintings of that place. And that is remarkable kind of thing. Now, normally we have this idea in the 40s, when everybody talked about Abanindranath, thought he was a rather effeminate, wishy-washy kind of painter. But when you look at something like this, these paintings, of course, I have to again remind you, is very small. It's like a notebook page, maybe like this size, okay? That is what it is. And then you look at the details of that painting. You can see that within that there is so much detail, including that little kite on which is stuck on the palm tree. And you get closer and you see more and more details. Or this one. This is the Saminda's office of the Tagores. And I mean, of course, now when you go there, you don't have this little river, but you have a road there now, so that is gone. But it's in Bangladesh, and so there's a little rickety kind of bridge that leads to the landing, and you can see the person who is standing there on that landing is actually Rabindranath himself. Okay, and you see the structures of these tiny little things. I mean, when you look at the whole thing, in the original, these should not be even a centimeter kind of thing. I mean, these trees. And when you look at them, you see they are so structurally strong and all those fine detailing that he does. So in a sense, his kind of painting was certainly not the normal idea of the Bengal school that we have. Or again, a purely imaginary thing. Makhdoom Sahib was a Sufi saint who is supposed to have visited that place. He came sometime in the Middle Ages. So now Abanindranath and is actually, there's a tomb which is still there. Now, of course, it is highly elaborated and completely destroyed, but it is a very quiet little place, and Abanindranath is kind of picturing himself like a man from maybe Renaissance Italy coming to visit that place. I mean, that figure in the foreground almost reminds you in terms of its rendering, like somebody like as if Pero della Francesca was doing it. And that kind of fine refinement and the empathy that he builds up within animals, within movements, these are the kind of fine touches that Abanindranath really brings to his painting. So these set of landscapes that he did, he didn't paint too many of them, but they certainly have a lot of fine detailing and touches. Then he moves at the end of the 20s to theater back again, but now trying to use actual characters into as mask. Now Dinendranath is one of the nephews of Tagore, and he was a musician, but all of them acted in their place. So there is Dinendranath playing the role of Raghupati, and which is a character in one of Rabindranath's play, or this is Abanindranath's own son playing the role of Kumarasena in another kind of thing. So these are little like puppet-like things which he did, or he called them mask, which are things. But you can see there is a person whom he knew, an actual person, is transformed into a different character in this. Now, after this is what I want to focus on. I have been this very long, winding introduction, that he does in the next year, in 1930, he did 45 paintings of really great brilliance. And 45 paintings in 1 year, when we look at the paintings, is a Herculean task. We'll realize that. They are all very, very detailed, very minutely done. And after that, he didn't paint for a long while. He just stopped. Okay. Now, these paintings, they have the technical mastery which is exceptional. The themes are very complex. They have an intellectual subtlety which surpasses everything that we saw. Already what we saw had quite a bit of that, but this surpasses all that, and probably we have that kind of subtlety, intellectual subtlety in Indian art very rarely. Now, these three aspects together make it one of the highest peaks in modern Indian art, and also in his own career. He himself said that my life's experience is there, and it's just all of that put together. Okay. Now, these are based on the Arabian Nights. Now, as you know the Arabian Nights in a sense, the core of the Arabian Nights is stories that travel from India. Okay. Stories like the Panchatantra and all that. When it traveled westward, in the Middle East, it got kind of other stories were added onto it. There were Persian elements, Arabic elements, European elements. So stories from all over the East and the West all mingled in that. And that created the Arabian Nights. It is an Arabic text, not a Persian text, it's an Arabic text. And also it has a connection with, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, they started translating it into all European languages, including English, of course, the French, German editions and so on. And it was always popular in this part of the world. And because one of the more or less complete, text of the Arabian Nights was found in Calcutta. So that text also served as the basis for many of the translations. So not only did the stories travel from India, but it got amalgamated with other kind of elements that came from other cultures, and then the core text, which at least the Urd text that, as the translator would say, was in Calcutta. So all these things came together for his interest. And in a sense, the Arabian Nights was also an Orientalist text, like the Rubaiyat, because it's translated by Europeans and partly to create a picture of the East, which they wanted. And if you read the English translations, it's copiously footnoted. Every word is explained. What is the meaning? What's this? What's that? And sometimes the meanings are right, sometimes they're. There are a lot of scholarship, certainly, but it is also, you can see they're trying to project their understanding of the East onto the text. So it is a very perfect Orientalist kind of project, the Arabian Nights. Now, he picks this up to illustrate. But now you can see when he does illustrate this thing, he's not doing it like the way he did either the first illustrations that he did for Chitrankatha, where he was not up to the text. Then in Omar Khayyam, we can say he is on par with the text. When he's doing Shankaracharya, he's actually making fun of it in some sense. Here he is not only critical, but he's, producing a counter text to the Arabian Nights. So he is not just identifying with the text, he's not internalizing the Orientalism, but is now countering the Orientalism of the text. Now we'll see this as we go, and as I said that he was, and most of you might know at least the basic stories of the Arabian Nights. Of course, in so many, films and animations and all that kind of thing. Even younger generation might be familiar with some of that. So the central theme is there's this king called Shahryar, and he has this strange habit of marrying a virgin, deflowering her, and the next morning killing her. So he does that. So every day he marries a new woman and kills her the next morning. So there is, and you can see here, there is this morning thing after that the king is seated, the sword is there, and the woman who would be killed is weeping, and the rest of the people are helplessly watching. And again, these are very small paintings. Because you have to remember that to appreciate the detailing of the works. Look at this drawing. Perhaps one of the most powerful miniature drawings that you can think about. And we'll see these kings also. There are very interesting things that this happens in the thing. Now, this is the kind of seed story around which the whole Arabian Nights come, and the story is that, of course, one of the women whom he marries, Shahrazadeh, she begins to tell him stories, narrate stories at night. And the story doesn't end. So the early morning, the story is unfinished. So the king says, okay, I'll spare you today because I want to listen to the rest of the stories. Like that, she tells stories for 1001 nights. And in the meantime, they have children and they have a family, and then the king decides he will spare her life. So in the process, not only her life is spared, but life of all the women whom he would have killed is spared. So it's a story about winning freedom in some sense, and winning freedom by the person who is not powerful. I mean, winning freedom from the most powerful by the person who is totally powerless. So that's the story. And he brings in various elements into this. So the Wazir's daughter is Shahzade, who comes forward and says, I'll marry him. So the father is obviously, I mean, not happy, and she tells him various stories to convince him. But of course, this scene probably would not be there in the Arabian Nights. But what we see is actually, if she's such a wonderful storyteller, she should have a tradition of storytelling. She should have learned it somewhere. She could not have invented storytelling that one night. So you see the father and the daughter sitting and telling stories. And she's already prepared for that in a sense. And there's this younger sister who plays a minor role in the story, so she's also there. But what is interesting is, I'll come to this painting later, but this sort of thing is the final effect. The king who wanted to kill is listening to the stories and he's transformed. Not the king of the first picture who is sort of ruthless. Now it's a kind of king who is completely kind of transformed. I mean, who is kind of, he started as an impulsive, cruel actor in the first place. Now you can say he's a thoughtful and much softened person. So, and you can see that Shahzada is almost, I mean, observing the transformation on his face. That from this very cruel man into this much more empathetic, softer person. And part of it is actually, again, coming back to that sense of melancholic element that you find in him. This is a photograph of the late Mughals in Calcutta. The last emperor, of course, died just about 2 years before Abanindranath was born in Rangoon. Okay? And these photographs of these people taken largely by Bourne and Shepherd were circulating. And you see that same quality of, I mean, softness and this melancholic softness in these pictures very much. So in some sense, he was also reliving that cultural moment in some way through some of these figures. A ruminative melancholy that we see in the face of the king can also be noticed in some of these. Okay, we'll get back to this painting. Now, this storytelling, what is interesting is that when you look at this, look at these two figures. Now, they are so different in the way of rendering. I mean, that the young woman is rendered quite differently from the way the old man is rendered. As if you are having two styles at the same thing simultaneously. The old man, if you want to compare with something, it would be like Titian's portraits, that kind of thing. And some of this, if you want to compare, it will be like the most kind of subtle pre-Raphaelite stuff. So there are two cultures, two kind of figures. So styles don't represent the artist anymore. Styles are part of the narrative content. Now this is something which is very modern in a sense. Picasso does that in his, I mean, Demoiselles d'Avignon. All these women are differently styled, and scholars now understand the stylistic differences as something where style is substituting a narrative kind of thing. So he started the painting as a narrative, and then style takes on that role. And he has done in many other things. Picasso did this throughout his year, that these two different kind of people are represented through two different styles. Or even the other person who understood this and took it forward is David Hockney, the Egyptian and the modern put together in some sense, as if they are in a conversation. So this is precisely what Abanindranath is also doing. He is using style as part of the narrative. I mean, and this is a technique when this narrativization that you see being repeatedly used in the Arabian Nights. Okay. Now, the other elements it does, other part of the technique is like in this case, the same three figures, the Wazir and his daughters. Now their appearance have changed. They look very different, and so in a sense he is completely reimagining them, as if you think in terms of, I mean, the same story being like shot in two different versions of the film. I mean, you think about how those characters has to be represented. So he does this kind of a thing, which is continuously happening in his stories. The other element that might happen is that the same figures then come to play different things. So one, you can think about, the first you can think about the same characters represented by different actors in a way. The second you can think about as the same actor representing different characters, I mean, which you see very often in Bengali, for instance, Soumitra Chatterjee in all those Ray films playing different roles, kind of a thing. Now, of course, this is also an interesting thing. I don't want to go into the details of the thing. This is again where the king really begins to has this idea of killing his wife starts. He and his brother, the king and the brother, went out for hunting, and then they talk. The brother says that his wife was not, true to him, and therefore, and then he has developed this idea, all the wives should be cheating on their husbands. So then both these people come back from the hunting, they leave the hunting, come back and peep into the harem through a hole, and according to the story, of course, the king sees that his wife was enjoying with the eunuchs in the thing. So that is where he decides to not only to kill her, but to marry and kill all the women that he marries. Okay, but so you can see, the king himself is transformed into different kind of character. I mean, not the cruel character, but a right comical character here in some sense, looking through this peephole. And in some way, you can even think that the little vignette of at the bottom, like monkeys on a tree, I mean, that seems to be a comment on the king and his brother there above. Okay. Now you can see this brother behind suddenly playing another role in another story. Okay. So he's actually using these two techniques of reimagining the characters and sometimes having the same actors play different characters in different things. The same guy who was the king in one of the last things, now he is one of the lovers of this woman. Okay. Now, other things that he brought into the picture is things that didn't exist in the Arabian Nights. There is a story of Aladdin and the lamp, but there was no lamp shop in the actual Arabian Nights. And he never worked in a lamp shop, Aladdin. But he puts this in. Why does he put it in? Because where Abanindranath lived, it's a very interesting street. He, as I said, used to sit in the south veranda and look out, and you can see the shops and other things around. And there were various lamp shops, tupi shops, etc., run by the Muslims. There were Chinese in that area. There were Tamilians, Bihari potters, all those things. Even today, when you go through that street, you can see quite a lot of this. So all these people were coming and mixing, because Arabian Nights itself is a product of another period where different cultures mixed, and where trade actually brought cultures together. Now he is living in the early 20th century, where through colonialism and trade, once again cultures and people are mixing, and that is happening just around his house, and he is sitting there and seeing all this. So he puts a lamp shop which doesn't exist, which is not part of the story of Alauddin, and he puts that in. Or he puts the magic carpet. He substitutes the magic carpet with the spying glass. So it is like, which is again something that many modern painters have used. The French painters in the opera house, using these opera glasses, to look maybe at people, other people in the other boxes or whatever kind of thing. And you can see this very interesting use of how the opera glass brings, which is far, to close in rays, Charulata. Where this, woman who is bored and completely locked up in house looks through these opera glasses at what is happening on the street and finds interesting things there. So the magic carpet is transformed into the opera glass, which also allows you to transcend space and reach new spaces. What is far can be brought near. And there are other elements, like you can see that the tap, the little kind of thing, which obviously is not in the Arabian Nights, but it's a detail of contemporary Calcutta that he weaves into the story. Okay. Or these three stories of the three sisters. Now, of course, in the Arabian Nights, it takes place somewhere in the Middle East, but here it's transformed into Calcutta. And these three sisters are clearly Bengali women, and one marries the kind of the cook of the king, the other one marries the person who hawks the kind of things, and then the third one, which is the youngest and the most ambitious, she actually finally marries the king himself, kind of thing. So this is again that of cultural transformation and transcendence. What is interesting is that this bread box, that is kind of thing, that is the initials there, which is half seen, which is one of the famous now hotels in Calcutta. And those days, they used to hawk their things on the streets. So the hawker really, so there is a kind of bringing in these elements, and the contemporary, kind of folk poetry or whatever, jingles often have these elements in them, which say how this is transforming and changing things. So, and there are plays, written around these things. And one of the things, of course, is the train, for instance, is something that really breaks class barriers, because everybody has to travel together and caste cannot be maintained and so on. So the other things that does is the European food, for instance. And so that is being kind of thing. So it's also to bring out the story of cultural intermixing. And sometimes it can be very complex, as in this marriage of Nur al-Din. He deviates from the story in the Arabian Nights completely. In fact, it's much more closer to Nur al-Din's son's marriage rather than Badr al-Din, and that is where kind of thing, but we are not going into the details. I want to just show you what happens in the thing. In the beginning, of course, there are these interesting things in the top and the bottom. They are quite different. On the top, you see this bridegroom arriving, but actually the bridegroom, on the horse, he was not supposed to marry. He really becomes a bridegroom later, but the king had actually set this dwarf in the front. He wanted the dwarf to marry that girl, whom is supposed to be beautiful, but she was not willing to marry the king. So in punishment, he gets her married to a dwarf. But finally, at the moment of marriage, he is substituted by this bright youth on the horse, who comes from nowhere, and then kind of thing. But it's also the the detailing or the different cultural elements that brings into it. There are these things, the camels, etc., which puts the thing in one cultural space, and then there are in between spaces. I mean, you can see those details. I mean, and then the in between spaces where the middle spaces, which is about, you're seeing through a curtain into the area where the women are there, and at the bottom you have this completely different, the cook and his assistant. So the marriage is there, the party is going on, and that creates one kind of cultural image. At the bottom, I mean, there is all that sound and fury there, but it's now very quiet and thing. The feast is probably served, and the cook and his assistant is quietly having a word. Now, this really, in a sense, brings in these details not only to localize, but also to transform. This is almost like, I mean, little realistic details in romantic novels. I mean, you are kind of bringing in a sense of the place and the sense of reality into the picture, which is basically an imaginary tale. Or sometimes these changes are very deliberately and meant to reverse arguments. For instance, in the Arabian Nights, the king is a Greek king and the physician is the Arab. But in the image, it is turned the other way around. I mean, the Arab becomes the king and the physician becomes the Greek. Now, why does he do that? The story is about a king who had, I mean, uncurable disease. This physician cures him by giving a polo stick to play with. And the polo stick is medicated, so the medicine works through him, and as he plays, and he's cured. Then the other people, and the king is very fond of the physician. The other courtiers tell him that this man is dangerous because he cured you with a stick. Now he can actually kill you also in the same way. So you better get rid of him. And so the king decides to, I mean, kill the doctor. So he tells the doctor that I'm going to kill you. The doctor says, okay, but I would like to serve you even after my death. So give me a few days leave, I'll go home, there is a book of great knowledge, I'll bring it and I'll gift it to you. When my head is cut, you can put it on a platter and you can ask me questions and I will still answer you. So I'd like to serve you. So he goes, gets this thing, he's beheaded, the head is put, and the king tries to read from the book, but then he sees the pages are not turning quickly. So he kind of, I mean, puts a little spittle and takes that and then kind of thing, and the book is poisoned, so the king dies. So that is what happens. Of course, on the book, what you really see is his signature, Abanindranath. That is what is written there. So it is about, I mean, there are a number of stories, not just this one, in the thing, which tells the story of either we have faith in each other, help each other, or if we try to kill, we kill each other. So there are many stories from the Arabian Nights which he does that. So it's a commentary on colonialism itself. Whether as different people, different cultures, whether you want to kind of coexist and help each other, or whether we want to kind of fight and kill each other in a sense. Now, so he is using this, as I said earlier, as a counter narrative to the Arabian Nights, and it's also an anti-colonial text in some ways. Now, I mean, an Orientalist text turned into a, I mean, anti-colonial text. Now here, for instance, this story in the Arabian Nights is entirely different. There is a woman who is convalescing, and she has this desire for fruits, and her husband, I mean, with great difficulty gets her some unseasonable fruits from very distant places. And then one day a Moor is caught with those fruits, and the husband is a wazir, so he catches up this man. He asks, where did you get the fruit? He says, your wife gave it to me. So he becomes angry with his wife, jealous of his wife, and comes and kills her. So it is like a Desdemona kind of, Othello and Desdemona kind of story. But he reverses altogether. Here, of course, it's not a woman who has 3 children. Actually, the children actually took the fruits to play, and the Moor had snatched it from the children. That's in the Arabian Nights. She's an young girl. She's still playing with her kittens and things like that. So basically, it's a story of a young girl awakening to sexuality rather than that of a matronly woman, tragically killed by her jealous husband. So the story is completely transformed. It is almost going as if to an imaginary moment somewhere at the back of that character. Of course, I'll end with 2 more images. The story of the hunchback and the fishbone. And this, again, like the story we saw before of Nuruddin, is composed in a similar manner. Now, what happens that if you sit, as I said, in the south veranda and look around, you can see it's a city that's stacked up. You can see what's happening in the veranda or the room of the next house and what is on the street and so on. So he uses that kind of vision to compose this picture. And in the Arabian Nights, it's a story about a tailor and his wife. The story is happening in China in the Arabian Nights, and the tailor and his wife are bored, so they catch hold of the hunchback and bring him home, and they feed him. They are thought that he will have some amusement with this hunchback, and the wife feeds him rice balls with fish bones hidden in it. So when he swallows the rice ball, one of it gets caught in his throat and he loses consciousness. So the couple think that they have murdered him. They died. And so they're afraid. They take it and throw it into a Jewish apothecary's place. And from there, he finds him. He thinks he died in his hands. So he throws him into another person and then compound and so on. And the king's man who is in charge of the king's kitchen. And then he thinks that he killed him and throws him, puts him in the front of a shop of a Christian. So actually in the story, it is a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, everybody comes in the thing. And then this man is seen, the shop owner is seen pushing this man from the front of his shop, and he dies, and then he's caught for killing this man. And the king decides, okay, this man murdered him, so he should be kind of thing. But when this innocent shop owner is going to be killed, the previous guy thinks, okay, it's because of me. So he goes and confesses. Then when that man is going to be killed, the other man earlier kind of thing. So finally it goes back to the tailor. All of them go and confess to the king that this is how it happened. The king is amused and said, okay, I'll free you if you all tell me similarly interesting stories. And they all tell stories within stories, and they all get their freedom. So that is an interesting thing in itself. But what is happening is it is transformed into Calcutta again, Yeah. And this method of telling is, so you have the tailor, but tailor obviously is not a Chinese tailor, but a tailor, poor tailor in Calcutta who is next door to his own house. Okay. And behind you see this Art Tagore and Co., which is where Abanindranath is himself seated, and he is the man with this topi and this spectacles. And so it's then brought back to Calcutta. So really the story moves around not the main narration, but the inset of Abanindranath or the Tagore household. That is where the story really gets its meaning from. So this is a method that you find in European painting, especially in Baroque painting. We can see a little inset which really is the thing that gives narrative meaning to the thing. So it's not that of a cook and an elderly lady in the kitchen, but that what is transpiring in the front is related to that little biblical painting behind which you see. So these inserts are very important in making. So Abanindranath actually uses a similar technique. When he's using it, he's also using a compositional thing that he probably gets from miniature painting. And this miniature painting was in his collection. He was also a great collector of miniature paintings. They had over 400 works in their collection. So where you can see, this is a Pahadi Ramayana, where you can see various events taking place in various parts of the thing. So the story is narrated within one sheet, but in each little space something is happening. The Rajguru is coming, so Ram and Sita is falling at his feet, then other things are happening in the house, and then they're having a feast, and then in the end you can see they're actually going off on their vanavas and so on. So a lot of things are happening, and many events are punched together into a particular scene. So this is something, and he knew this, and he had this manuscript, he had this picture in his collection. So he's doing something similar when he's doing it, but it's also based on the visual experience that he has sitting in the south veranda. Okay, and there are various elements. So this is where the tailor and his kind of thing, and the apothecary, the Jewish guy, is transformed into a Muslim little, person with a little, shop beneath that, and the guy who is in charge of the king's ladder, he is kind of transformed into a bania kind of thing. So all those things are there, but the caste, the cultural groups, etc., changes. So they are brought into his own cultural sphere in a sense. So you can see those things, the apothecaries with his little instruments and so on, and this bania kind of merchant, with all his kind of thing. He is in charge of the king's godowns and so on. Now, what is important is this, where the whole story gets a twist. You can see that Abanindranath is there, and he is also feeding two hunchbacks, but Europeans. Okay? And you can see how the hunchback actually takes over his life, because that is what the hunchback did. The tailor and his wife wanted to have fun and brought the hunchback in, but the hunchback then became a burden for them. So here what happens, he gets the white men, entertains them, and then they become a burden, and now they transform his life and life of his family. And you can see this half-hidden portrait behind the panga. That is Dwaraganath, the great grand-uncle, Rabindranath's grandfather. So he is there. He was the empire builder. He collaborated with the British, but he also did the Union Bank, which was the first Indian bank, which is founded by Dwaraganath. He invested in coal, he invested in railways, he invested in shipping, and you can see a little picture of the ship there, and so on. And he was very lavish with his wealth. So he had parties which in contemporary European newspapers are described as almost Arabian Night events kind of thing. And he went to England, of course, met the Queen and had met Dickens and so on and so forth. So he was a big dandy in some sense. And you can see the impact. You can have the Union Jack flying on the top of the house, because he couldn't entertain all these people in his house. His wife would not allow that. So he had a whole new big building which was called the Tagore Castle, where these parties happened, and which had a Union Jack actually flying there. And in fact, there is a Bengali kind of folk four-liner which tells about all the sound of the forks and knives in this thing and what is happening there, but the subaltern outside doesn't really, we only hear those clattering, but we don't get to eat those things, we don't get to see those things, so kind of thing. So in fact, Abanindranath is using all of that. now he has a liveried servant like them and so on. So basically it's about what happened to them. And he had a company which he had kind of run with European called Art Tagore and Co. That is what is, that's a company for importing and exporting items and so on. So the board tells that. So Dwarkanath is there only in that photograph or that portrait behind, but that whole burden of collaboration with the Europeans is now taken over by Abanindranath. So the story is not about the Arabian Nights, it is about how colonialism transformed not only India but including his family in a sense. Now the last one I would look at is this one called the Sinbad the Sailor. Again, which is a very interesting work because which is very different from that of the Sinbad story in the Arabian Nights. As you know, the Sinbad story in the Arabian Nights is about the sailor, adventurer. He goes out and the stories are about his adventures. Okay, so you can see I'm just showing you a few illustrations of others, how others did the Arabian Nights. Other people who painted or illustrated the Arabian Nights. So you can see this, Sinbad being tied to the leg of a shimog and flying in the air. Or he has this adventurer, and even in the sea it is these big waves, almost like Hokusai waves, swallowing his ship and being thrown out and coming back with a lot of wealth and all these kind of things. So he's basically a sailor and an adventurer. And even in the film, so he's almost like a little kind of prefiguration of a sailor and a kind of maybe a kind of adventurer and a kind of macho, modern things, like a little bit of a prefiguration of a sailor and and James Bond kind of thing. And you can see the advertisements for those films. This is what is kind of thing. So the sailing, the adventure, the kind of women who are attracted to him and so on. And all those, I'm just showing you a couple of things, how this has been imagined in popular culture, including Japanese manga, for instance, or with Popeye the sailor and Sinbad the sailor meeting each other, or even when children kind of do, they are almost like, as if between the adventurer and the pirate kind of thing. But Abanindranath's Sinbad is quite different from that, all those kind of imagination. His Sinbad is a person who is a learned scholar with books and telling stories, and he's a storyteller in that sense. And here again there are interesting things in this thing. The story is written about, just as I said, in this quasi-Persian thing. But actually if you try to read it, what you see is that the story is narrated as if it's narrated by some illiterate, broken words and all that. Now that is a deliberate juxtaposition, because the painting is in a style which is extremely sophisticated. This cannot be done by any ordinary artist. It's not like that of a folk artist, but it's that of a courtly artist, like kind of thing, with great skill and technical competence and all that. But the thing which is written there is just the opposite. It is a hybrid kind of language and without grammatical structures and things like that. So he's actually bringing two cultural strata together within the thing. And he's also telling us a narration does not exist at one cultural level, it has many cultural levels. And if you think about it, think about any of our texts, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, etc. So many kind of versions of that, the folk versions, the classical versions, the Sanskrit, the Kannada, the Tamil, the Malayalam, whatever kind of thing. So many versions, both in all kinds of horizontal, vertical, whichever way you think, there are so many registers of that narration. So he's bringing in that. He is more and more interested in these differences or the connections between the different narrative stratas. And also what is behind him, in a sense, is this picture of the ship. And he hasn't traveled. If he has traveled, he has only traveled in imagination. He has traveled through books. I mean, so he's a storyteller who has gained. I mean, even if you look at the first thing of the Wazir and his daughter, they were telling stories and they had books in their hands. They had books on the shelf behind. Now, he is such a person, and his signature is on that little seat where they think he has written Abanindra. So he is identifying himself with that storyteller in a way. And he's dipping into different traditions again. The picture and storytelling with a picture is an Eastern tradition. Of course, here you have an Iranian pardedar, that is, the parda is the picture, and you have in contemporary fiction many of these representations. Now, so that is one tradition that is dipping into, or even the Bengali tradition of the Patua, who is showing the pictures and narrating the stories. So the idea that he is somebody who has the picture behind of a sailor, which is kind of thing. And if you look at that picture, is also very interesting because it proves that is an unrealistic thing. And you can see this is young Abanindranath as the classroom of the college where he seated, almost like one of those storytellers. And he was a great recounter. He told stories immensely, and his writing is almost like oral literature. Although his written text, it actually has like oral literature. It's as if he's telling stories, I mean, orally kind of thing. So he dips into that. The other thing he takes is that the composition of the thing, where there's a central figure and others around him. This is, of course, the famous painting of the House of Timur, and then there are other things. Babur receives the courtiers. So Mughal painting has many of these things, or Akbar in conversation with other religious figures and so on. And you get these drawings. And I'm showing these things to you because he had also this in his collection. These are drawings that he owned. So some of these elements are also coming from his constantly, even other figures in the Arabian Nights, you can actually trace to some of the drawings of the Mughal things that he had himself. Or this idea of this double portrait of a grown-up and a child, which is also there. This is Shah Jahan with Dara Shikoh, and or in this late colonial painting where you have a Nawab with his sons on a gaddi, and you have the Indian and Europeans, I mean, courtiers and others seated around him. So these kind of things were there, and he was probably familiar with. So he uses those structures to structure this. So at the center you have the storyteller and the thing child, which, like in those other double portraits that we saw. But for him, this meant something. I mean, the child, he thought there was a child in the artist every time. It is the artist is somebody who doesn't outlive his childhood in some sense. And if you go through all his writings, I mean, a lot of it is autobiographical, Abanindranath's writing. And you will never see a middle-aged Abanindranath in his writings. Either he is a child Abanindranath or is an old man Abanindranath. The middle-aged, when you are supposed to be the man of the world, that is totally absent. You can only see two figures in his writing. I mean, himself as a child or himself as an old man, nothing in between. So really speaking, he saw himself as a combination of these two things. And probably so they share this thing. So it's not this pictorially what he takes from the painting, he's transforming it, and it means something else for him. Okay. Now, he's a man who has not traveled, but traveled in imagination, who has read. And who are the people who come to listen? It is people from across the world. So you see that Sinbad the sailor is a man, a real adventurer, goes out into the world, travels across, lots of experience, comes back, then he tells stories to people in his mohalla. That is what Sinbad does. But here you have a Sinbad who has not traveled, but traveled in imagination, traveled through scholarly means, and then he has the whole world coming to listen to his stories. So he has completely reversed the Arabian Night idea of Sinbad kind of a thing. It's about storytelling. It's about what modern art is about. I mean, you have an audience, an international audience. You may not be the guy who goes around. Your adventures are intellectual. Your adventures are those of imagination. And you can have a captive international audience listening to you. So he is both turning the tables in some sense on the Arabian Nights, but he's also making an anti-colonial statement, very things, because what we lost as I started my lecture was our ability to narrate our own stories. India was reduced into those pictures of objects. What is regaining is this ability to tell our own stories. I mean, not have India fragmented and shown in little bits of things, but we can tell our own stories. You don't need the European to tell our stories, which was the Orientalist project, that they are the ones who are telling our stories. But he is now using Shahzadeh, and it's important because the Europeans thought we were very effeminate, especially the Bengalis were absolutely effeminate, and so he turns this thing. The woman really becomes a storyteller, wins her freedom, not only for herself, but all her kind. So in a sense, he's now reversing it, and he is turning the Arabian Nights into this whole project of regaining our narrative voice. And as artists, how can we regain that? How can we, bring back narration or narrating our collective experiences? This is Abanindranath's basic nationalist project, not reviving Indian art, not reviving a particular stream of it. That he is not interested in some sense. Not political at all. Really speaking, he was a bit of a coward. He didn't take part in all these things. He never went, and met Gandhi. Although Gandhi came to their house, others, his student Nandalal did, but he didn't participate in that kind of political nationalism. When Rabindranath went out doing all these things, he was afraid. He almost ran back into his house and told, now on the Rakhi Bandhan day, they went out, against the partition of Bengal. So Tagore led the procession. It was his idea, and he said, Abanindranath, you come along. So he had to go, but he went half the way, and then Rabindranath was going to tie Rakhis on the people in the nearby mosque. So he thought, now this will end up in a kind of bloodshed, and he ran back home and created a chaos at home, saying, now Ravi Kaka, my Ravi uncle, has gone there and he is going to be in trouble. Nothing of that sort happened, but so he was not the bravest of men. He was not a political nationalist at all, but he had a subtle way of accepting that position of the feminine that was thrust upon Indians and on maybe on himself, and then turns the table around, and through narration brings back the right and the ability to narrate our stories. So thank you very much. I know I have overshot the expected time by a little.
Unknown images. I had questions which you have partly answered, but I'll ask them anyway. One is, clearly he did not draw anything from either the style or the quantity or even the kind of content of the Bhattala print.
Yeah.
You mentioned the narrative tradition of the Patachitra, but the Bhattala print was already there and in much abundance before he began his work. So, I'm just wondering, what did he draw from that? Or did he anywhere have a critique of that kind of work?
No, in fact, he collected.
Can I ask all my questions?
Oh, yeah.
Just, is that okay?
Yeah, please.
The second was, of course, I was going to ask the question, but then you did show a couple of slides in which the European has appeared. how frequent was that in terms of, because you actually give it a gloss that it is something that is almost anti-colonial. I would dispute that in terms of the representation, but in any case, how frequent was that in terms of an image that appears in his work? To what extent did he use these figures? And the third, I have many questions, but I'll stick to only one more, and that is, how is it that we have not seen this work? You've said that the family has kept his material quite carefully or under lock and key and so on. But Modern Review did reproduce quite a large number of the Bengal school works. Did they not appear there, or was there a reason for that? I'm just asking.
Yeah, I mean, the Borthala was always there. In fact, because you can't say everything in this, even this 2-hour thing, he collected a lot of those texts. In fact, he also collected the Borthala also produces something like the Arabian Nights. So he had the translations, the English translations, and he had the Borthala translations, and he has a large collection of these things. And so he also had Hindi versions. He had multiple kind of translations of the Arabian Nights, including all these things from Borthala too. And he used that, and there are certain other things after that. He, after doing this for the next 15 or 10, 15 years, he actually writes jatras, which are like the folk plays. But they are not folk plays because they are too sophisticated in thing, but they almost look like that, sound like that, but not. So he was drawing on all those things. And in fact, in one of the stories from 1924, Mashi, he is this little Aban again, and he is going to his Mashi's house, his aunt's house, and talking about, and he says that I would paint like these people, the folk artists, the Borthala and the other folk artists. And he says, oh, but maybe, when I go to study art with Nandalal, he may not teach me those things. So basically, he is having that whole thing. He is the elite, but he is somebody who is very kind of sensitive and interested in the subaltern things, of subaltern cultures, narratives, and so on. So he's actually moving between these two phases. In fact, that is why he uses the language in this text. It's almost like the Dubashi languages that you have in some of those Borthala things. So he is actually incorporating it into it. And in his stories, in his literature, you have quite a bit of that also. So he does it in many ways. There are not many Europeans in their kind of thing. And so there are only, in this series, there are, I think, only these two paintings that I showed. There are not many of them. Okay. Because, and what was the last one you asked was the... Oh yeah, not very many. See, the problem with this, until I read the Arabian Nights and compared, identified, I first read it just to identify the pictures. So the Arabian Nights were hardly published. 1 or 2 came out, but not the whole lot. And I think these are intellectually too complex, and including his own students just simply stopped looking at it. They looked at it, but they didn't really understand what it was saying. So until and unless you read them against the text, and then you notice all the differences. I just pointed out a few, but there are many more differences that you can point out. And so then you realize that he is not illustrating it at all, but he is producing a counter text. And this is again a very modernist project. If you think about Ulysses, James Joyce, they are also using those old texts as a pointer, and then to create a distance between what you are doing and the old text. And so the meaning exists somewhere in these differences. And so that is what he is trying to do. And that cannot be brought out unless you study these texts very carefully. So nobody did that, really speaking, unfortunately. And I just found that out when I started reading the text, because I didn't know what it represented. So I wanted to find out, so I read the text, and as I began reading the text and looking at the images, I saw these differences. So that is why it got thing. And after independence, they thought the Bengal school was merely illustrative and it was narrative. Two ideas which modern artists didn't like, so they threw out the whole thing. Nobody studied. So right when I started studying them in the 80s, still they were completely looked down upon, including in the Indian art colleges when he was taught. I mean, he was just described as a kind of revivalist. The only person who did a work on it was Ratan Parimu in the 60s, his PhD. But in that book, if you think the Arabian Nights is just literally one paragraph of 5 lines kind of thing. I didn't show you what he did after this, which is equally fascinating. I mean, so nobody really thought of an artist being working. For him, the picture is not a representation, but it is a cultural text. And it is a cultural text which comes alive through its interaction with other cultural texts. So we have to read that in that sequence, and only then it comes alive. So that, I think, was a very complex idea to start with, which at that point of time nobody really recognized. Okay.
So, on behalf of National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, I firstly thank Professor Siva Kumar sir for this very insightful talk. Sir, thank you for accepting our invitation and being here for this enlightful talk. I request our director Uma ma'am, Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Karnataka, to kindly honor our speaker today by a small souvenir from our art shop. So please.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure listening to you.
So I thank one and all for joining us for this talk, and please follow us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter as well. Thank you once again.